Hello, Coachella Valley. I am Emily Falappino, President and CEO of the Greater Coachella Valley Chamber of Commerce. Today, I meet with the Chamber's Chief Policy Advisor, Chris Collier, for an important discussion about redistricting. This is a discussion that concerns all of us in the Coachella Valley, and we are here to call on every individual in the Valley to get involved and take some action. We need the voice of our Valley to be heard in Sacramento. So our talk today is intended to explain what redistricting is, why it matters, and what it's doing to the Coachella Valley as we know it today. Redistricting is happening now, so we're going to give you a real-time glimpse of what the outcomes may be, as well as what the consequences of the proposed redistricting lines mean for our Valley. Most importantly, we're going to give you clear direction on how you can take action and use your voice on behalf of our Valley. So with that, let me introduce Chris Collier. Chris?
Thank you, Emily. Great to be here. This is a really important discussion, so thanks for having me on today. This redistricting process happens once a decade, and it's really one of those things that it comes up, it happens, it's really intense for a few months, and then it disappears. Everyone forgets about it for a decade, and then we come back and go, what happened last time? So we're going to be looking a little bit at some of the lines, how they're going to change based on where things are, and then what we might want to do to move forward.
Awesome. Well, let's get right into it then. But let's start with the basics for those of us who don't remember exactly what redistricting is. Could you tell us what it is and how often it occurs? I think you said every decade.
Right. So every 10 years, 2010, 2020, before that, the census happens, right? United States government, federal government comes in and counts everybody. And so that count happens and produces the census that says who lives where, how many people in each jurisdiction, et cetera. One of the things that we do and what redistricting is the rebalancing, essentially, of the districts that represent us in government. And that happens in Sacramento, it happens in DC in our federal government, it happens all the way down to our local districts. Our cities, school boards, and water districts are redrawing their lines if they have district elections as well right now. And that all it's because one person equals one vote, right? And so the foundation of this is if a Senate district had a lot of growth and now has 1.1 million people, it needs to be equal to everyone else in the state. If the average district has 1.1 million people, it has to shed some people in order to be the same population, so that each vote of the 40 senators or 80 assembly members are equal in population, represent the same number of Californians, or same number of Californians in the federal government.
So in short, redistricting is all about just redrawing the boundaries and the lines of who governs where. And I understand that those lines are redrawn from everything from school districts to healthcare districts and all of our elected offices. So what we all need to understand right now is that all of our governing lines are being reassessed and redrawn based on the latest census data. Is that right?
That's correct. And one of the things that's interesting about this process, as opposed to where we were 10 years ago, we had COVID in 2020. Who could forget, right? And because of that, the responses to the census were delayed. So the data that we would normally be using to draw these maps, and I say we being everyone that's involved in this process, from advocacy organizations to the consultants to the agencies themselves, we all got the data, I think it was the end of September, and everything has to be done by the end of the year. So there is this rushed process right now to finalize a lot of the lines, especially at the state and federal levels, because those elections offices are up for filing beginning of February. So you need some time to prepare all of that. And so it's been a really condensed process going into this. And one other thing I'll add is 10 years ago in California, voters passed, actually it was 12 years ago the voters passed it, a ballot measure statewide that took this process out of the hands of the legislators themselves. Legislators used to draw their own lines. You say, well, you live over here, I live over there. I'd like this neighborhood in my district. You can have that one, and they horse traded things. Now it's done by a 14-member commission, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and 4 no party preference members that are supposed to be non-political. They can't be involved in donations to campaigns or have held elected office within a certain period of time. There's a bunch of requirements for it, and they go statewide to find these people. And so this commission has been working on drawing the state and federal lines for not just our valley, but the whole state over the last few months. And that's what we're really going to be focusing on today.
So based on what you've described, because we're redrawing so many lines, it sounds like this could be a really, almost inconsequential deal, or it could be a really big deal, depending on how many lines are being redrawn. So what are you seeing with the proposals?
So let's start by talking about how big a district is, right? A congressional district in 2010 had 659,000 people in it. Today, the target is 738,000 people. The 36th congressional district, Congressman Ruiz, that represents us here in the Coachella Valley, has 755,000 people in it. So it has to geographically get smaller. It has too many people, right? So essentially all the districts grew. You might have heard that California lost 2 congressional seats, but it doesn't mean that our population went down. It just means we didn't grow as fast as other places, namely Texas and Florida, and places that are just growing faster than California. And so with essentially what our area grew faster than other areas in California. So some of our seats have to get a little bit more geographically compact and shed some areas. So in 2010, 879,000 people roughly were in a state Senate seat. And now in 2020, you look at the Senate seat that includes the Coachella Valley, represented currently by Senator Melendez, who's termed out. It's 1,014,000 people. It has to get smaller, right? So where are we going to shed that population? And the other thing to think about in terms of what we're seeing is, when we'll talk about some of these connections, look at these maps, districts operate on almost a center of gravity, right? I run a lot of elections in my life, and the way this works is there's a base for everyone that gets elected, right? A neighborhood, a community, an area, a couple cities in a larger district. That's where you're well known as a candidate. That's where you're really going to draw your biggest support from. And honestly, it's where you're going to put your office. It's where you live. If you've got a far-flung part of your district, look, we've got some great representatives, and they definitely take the time to go to some of those places that are a little farther off the beaten path. But if you're not in that center of gravity, you're not the front of mind, right? And so if we're split up and put in different places as a valley, we don't have that kind of connection like we'd have to our representatives if they were the person you see in the grocery store every weekend.
Yeah, I think this is a really critical point. In fact, I was talking with a group of community leaders earlier this morning about it, and that's that the Coachella Valley, we are our own center of gravity. There are 9 cities. We're kind of set apart from the rest of Riverside County in lots of very unique ways. I mean, our potential development, our natural resources, some of the challenges in infrastructure, challenges that we face, they're all very unique to us. And the synergy between our cities, the shared vision, the ripple effects, and the consequences of one city's choices over to another's are very real. So with the discussion of redistricting, it's almost scary that if we were to kind of split our valley and some of our bigger cities became the minority in these other outside centers of gravity, that could really stifle our community development, our economic development, our infrastructure development. Am I seeing that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, if you look at the maps from 2010, one thing that was the way the commission worked, and I was involved in that process 10 years ago as well, is we're the edge of the state in some part, right? You have to go out to Blythe, and you have to look all the way to the west and go, okay, if I need 900,000 people and I'm running directly to the west, how many people can I fit into this district? How far west can I go? Am I going to Banning? Am I going to Yucaipa? Am I going to Palm Springs, right? Whatever that number you have to hit is. But essentially the strategy was start at the edge of the state, work inward. This time you're seeing some of that as well, but our congressional seat, our Senate seat, that's how they were drawn before, and it encompassed essentially the entire Coachella Valley. The assembly seats, they were too small to encompass the entire valley and that edge of the state, and so the valley was split in the assembly into 2. But where that split happens is going to change, is what it looks like based on the current maps. So a little bit about where we are today. The commission of the 14 members are in the home stretch. Everything should be done by the end of this month in December. And the maps that we have now, the last round of official draft maps was released November the 10th. There was a 14-day comment period on those. So prior to the 24th, everybody got comments in. And then after that, the only thing that's been released so far, we'll go into it in a second, is the assembly iterations, which is what will evolve to become the next draft maps. And there's been some changes specifically to Coachella Valley in that, from the draft on November 14th to the iteration that was released earlier in December. The next set of draft maps will be probably the last set of draft maps. When the Commission of 14 approves those maps, they will be the new districts starting January 1st. And so there's probably some nuances on who gets to represent what district when, and what happens if there is a vacancy, and the numbering process, and how does that work. I mean, if they change the numbers and you voted in one number, but all of a sudden the number changes, you're no longer representing the number that you were before. I mean, there's a lot of to that I'm going to leave off the table. I'm going to talk specifically about the lines, but if I can share my screen here. So what we're looking at here is me zooming in. This is on the State Redistricting Commission's website. And I'm going to unclick some of these things. So this is our Coachella Valley, right? Here we are, nice at home. And I have everything centered on where we are. Let's look at the current assembly districts, right? Right now, we're split in two. Essentially, La Quinta, Palm Desert, Palm Springs, are part, and Indian Wells and Rancho Mirage are all part of one assembly district, the 42nd, currently represented by Assemblyman Mays, and goes into Banning, Beaumont, Yucaipa, and then up here in Yucca Valley, 29 Palms, right? That's a district. The other district encompasses, again, working from the bottom and the edges and in, you have the entirety of Imperial County, the entirety of far eastern Riverside County out in Blythe, and going as far in as it can, which includes the entire city of Indio, my neighborhood here in Bermuda Dunes, and all of the Salton Sea in one area. And that's how we're split up at the assembly. If I click on the draft from November 10th, 2011, this is the last set of iteration, you see that the dividing line is right along Interstate 10. North of the 10 is in a district linked with Indio. South of the 10 is in a district linked with all of the rest of the Valley cities. And the Valley cities are linked with Banning, Beaumont, Yucaipa, similar to before, and the Yucca and 29 Palms area. So in order to shed some of that population, it changed. Now, I'm going to make a quick change here and unclick the draft and go to the iteration from 12.6. This is the one that came out literally just the other day. You notice that the line across the 10, Desert Hot Springs, what would be North Indio, parts of Cathedral City along the 10, all of that is now squarely in the 42nd Assembly District, right? And the 40th Assembly District changed a little bit along the edges here, along Banning and Beaumont. I think it dropped part of San Jacinto. But otherwise, it's mostly the same. But the finger, we'll call it, that's stuck in toward Desert Hot Springs, on the north side of the 10, is gone. Indio is kept whole and in one district. And I in Bermuda Dunes am now in the 42nd Assembly District, so my neighborhood switched. But we're connected essentially to a district that would be represented by Assemblyman Chad Mays, and then Assembly District 56 would be represented by Assemblymember Garcia.
Okay. So on the assembly member side, we're accustomed to having two assembly members throughout the valley. It's just the boundaries of who's claiming which cities and governing each city, essentially.
Yeah, it makes a little bit of a change for sure. And these new lines aren't going to make major change, but they do affect the margins a little bit in each of those districts in terms of voter turnout and those things. But one of the things that is interesting about redistricting is as soon as the lines are finalized, you'll start seeing people change their opinions for reelection. In 2010, I watched a 26-year congressman, I was living in Ventura at the time, decide to retire because the new lines had drawn him into a district that he had not represented before. By flipping literally 4 blocks, I think it was. So, people make those kind of decisions. And then, and where this gets interesting is, so someone doesn't run again, who steps up from local government potentially to run for those seats? And it's just becomes a domino effect, right? One person doesn't run, so 6 people are running for different offices now. And that changes your representation pretty much wholesale, all the way down to the city level sometimes. And so that's something interesting to be part of this process, and we're yet to see what those changes are like. We'll know when the maps are final what people decide to do in terms of elected leaders, but in terms of representation, this is really similar to where we've been in the past. Well, and I'll put them both here. You can see the main change here. in the 42nd district, is that finger was carved out previously, Desert Hot Springs and north of the 10, and now it has been essentially added to the 42nd. And they've lost some ground over here, the far west part of the district. So that's the assembly.
Okay, so that's the assembly, but what else is changing? Because
Okay.
I've heard a lot of chatter about the movement of lots of lines, and some of them a little bit more speculative, I guess I'll say. So what else can you tell us about what's proposed?
So let's look at the Senate seat. The Senate seat is similar to where we started. This is the current Senate seat, right? This is Senator Melendez's seat. It starts here, the California border, and moves west, like I was talking about, right? The entire Riverside County, from a north-south basis, is in this district. It does not go down into it does not go down into Imperial County. It does not go north into San Bernardino County. And then it comes down and takes Temecula and the far part of Riverside County and goes very far to the west. You can see this district, like Elsinore, Wildomar, Murrieta, Temecula, all in one giant Senate seat, right? The biggest change I think you're going to see in any district is how they've decided to draw the Senate seats. And I zoomed out to this level so you can see the state Senate seat that includes Imperial and coastal San Diego.
Okay.
And I'm about to click the Senate draft maps, which, by the way, these are the maps that were released on November the 10th. There have not been new iterations as of this taping. So I'm looking at this here, and now you can see it's pretty much the same southern border district, right? California-Mexican border. And instead of stopping in Imperial County, it needed more people because Imperial County did not grow as fast as other places. So in this iteration, the city of Indio is now linked to coastal San Diego in Imperial Beach, this giant district.
So just to pause you and to go back to something that you said a little bit earlier today in our talk, is that the center of gravity for a senator's seat, all of a sudden that changes, because Indio, which for us in the Coachella Valley is our largest city. It's I think the top 18 fastest developing cities in the country. It's a lot of potential, a lot of movement, a lot of reasons that we want to make sure that Indio's direction and governance is on board with the rest of the valleys. It looks like that's split off.
Yeah, this district it's a bizarre shape. I mean, it goes all the way up to Needles and all the way down to Imperial Beach and everything in between. So, in terms of center of gravity, if you live in Needles, your representative could live in San Diego. Think about the hundreds of miles or hours of drive time that is just to reach your representative's office. Centers of gravity our part of the Coachella Valley is definitely one of them in this district, but then Imperial County stands on its own, and then you have the large portion of San Diego County, which is going to drive the seat. This is one of the ones I think we're most concerned about in terms of how things are split. So I will say the city of Indio just is taken out of the rest of the Coachella Valley and put with Mecca, the Salton Sea, and Imperial, and cut off from La Quinta, Palm Desert, Cathedral City, Palm Springs, etc.
So I think that's significant and interesting from like Indio's perspective, in particular, Indio and Coachella, right? I think Coachella is also included in there, and
yes.
There are different cities. But also for the Coachella Valley as a whole, we've been accustomed to having one senator who is aware of our issues, our direction, and whatnot. But in this case, we're going to have two senators, is what it looks like. And because Melendez's seat is up, we don't quite know who those senators are going to be. So that's an interesting shift politically.
It is. And, to look at the other half of our valley in the new Senate seat, the other half of the valley will be in a very large geographical Senate seat. It's the western half of the Coachella Valley, La Quinta, Bermuda Dunes, and points north and west, and then going into part of Riverside County, but also including the resort towns of Big Bear, right? In the Big Bear Valley and the San Bernardino Mountains. So there's a lot of different geographical interests in the Senate seat, where if you look at the prior seat, we definitely had a more uniform representation in just Riverside County issues.
Yeah. So, and looking at the pros and cons, as a bipartisan organization, we try and look at, what are the potential positive and negative outcomes of either. And I suppose on one side of having two senators, you could say, well, gosh, that could potentially give us two voices where needed. That's assuming that both voices say the same thing and aren't in conflict with one another. On the other hand, having two senator seats in the Valley could almost, at some points put us at odds or stifle development. Is this going to be final, or what can still be said or done?
So there's still a discussion about the next draft of maps. There hasn't been a new iteration for the Senate released. It is expected that there will be some updates to this, and there is an opportunity to comment on those last maps so they can make final adjustments. One thing I think that is really interesting about this split, if our district has to get split, it's interesting to remove Indio as a city from the western part of the Coachella Valley, particularly because when you get into Coachella and Mecca, you're talking about more agrarian economy, right? Mm-hmm. More in line with what's going on in Imperial County, and that might make sense. But you're talking about taking the city of festivals and unlinking it from Palm Springs, which is the airport everyone flies into to go to said festivals, right? You've got a real tourism economy of interest there, community of interest, that I think is important to keep together. And there were discussions at the commission level about making we'll call it the Southeast California seat centered around the Salton Sea, more of an ag seat. But when it doesn't make a lot of sense to put Indio in with that when its economy is not ag, it's a tourism town.
Yeah. So, Chris, in an ideal world, it sounds like the Redistricting Commission was put together again to be bipartisan. What do you think are the factors that they look at as they go to draw map lines? Is it purely just population grabs?
So there's a couple of things that the commission looks for. It's not just population. Equal population is obviously very important. But first, the districts have to be contiguous. You can't have, let's say you wanted to draw Blythe in with Big Bear and skip the Coachella Valley. Well, you can't really do that because you have to make sure that the districts are contiguous and the line goes from one end to the other. The next issue is compactness. You have to make sure that districts are somewhat geographically compact. Sure, there's a lot of expanse, but there aren't a lot of people between some of these population centers, as we're seeing. But you have to do your best to try and keep those population centers together. And then the third thing, and this is really what drives a lot of the testimony, is community of interest. What is a community of interest? Well, there's a whole lot of things that qualify for that. And it's a group of people in some kind of geographic area that have some kind of political, social, or economic interest. So you could be talking about tourism. You could be talking about racial demographics. You could be talking about commute patterns. I mean, one of the reasons it makes sense to me to link the Morongo Valley down to the Coachella Valley is people drive in to go to work here, right? There was an early iteration of linking Yucca Valley with Victorville, and I highly doubt a lot of people are driving over the mountains to go to work, right? But when you think about where people actually go and where their lives are on a daily basis, you want to try and draw those areas of interest together.
Yeah, really good point. Okay, that's extremely helpful.
Sorry, I have one other thing I want to add that it is really important, and there are some rules through the Voters' Rights Act about how some of these districts have to be drawn. I'm not an expert on some of the nuances of them, but the general idea is minority-majority districts have to be preserved under state and federal law. So, if you have to have a certain number of them in certain areas to make sure minority representation is not diluted. And so sometimes you get funny looking districts because you have to keep percentages of various minority groups at certain levels to satisfy the requirements in line drawing. And all of that is also taken into consideration when you're drawing lines.
Interesting. So good considerations. Did they ever make that public? Like what went into the decision making, speaking to those specific factors and points you made?
Yes, we draw the lines ca.org. The website we're on now has all of the input and deliberation and all of the meetings. It's all publicly available. You can actually look at the top bar here. This is the same site that contains this map, has an ability to look up all the commissioners, has all of their meetings, past meetings, live meetings. It's all live stream available online. If you'd like to look and see public input and public comments, you can leave your own comments. If you'd like to see what everyone else's comments were on a statewide basis, all of that's available. So you can really look and see what helped shape the commissioners. I mean, let's be honest, there are people with various interests trying to move these lines around. And you can look at that comment and kind of draw your own conclusions to what forces might be influencing various patterns. But ultimately, it's up to the commissioners and what they see after digesting this huge amount of information in a state that is a small country, right? To try and draw these lines and put that together.
Yeah. So we've talked about the assembly seats and the senator seats. What other seats were
congressional? We got to talk about congressional.
Okay.
So again, congressional seat. We're looking at something. This is Dr. Raul Ruiz, our congressman, right? His district starts in the eastern part at the border of California, includes all of Riverside County, and goes as far west as it can. Then there's too many people, and then it stops, right? So in thinking about it this way, you look at that's how the district is drawn. The Coachella Valley is left whole. Riverside County is as intact as possible, and it does go into banning Beaumont and Hemet, and it makes it that far, but it doesn't quite make it into the 15 or the 215 corridor. So when you look at that, and then you look at what the district was drawn, that is the latest draft map, you can click here, and you can see that there is a large chunk drawn out of our congressional seat. And it's quite interesting. So Indian Wells, Palm Desert, this is Rancho Mirage, and the city of Palm Springs are now drawn into a district that goes through Riverside County and ends up linking to Corona, Norco, and that part of the county. It's a little bit of a bizarre linkage, but essentially our district was too big, needed to shed some population. And so for the most part, it's stayed the same, but instead of keeping some of our Coachella Valley cities whole, it then moved north into San Bernardino County and grabbed this large desert area, right? So it's a little bit weird how they decided to do that. I mean, they could have kept the north boundary here the same and kept more of the valley whole. You notice that in this district, we keep Hemet in the current congressional seat, but we take places like Palm Springs, Palm Desert, and Rancho Mirage and Indian Wells and move them out of the district. One of the reasons for that potentially is Voters' Rights Act. By population, those cities are demographically wider than some of the cities that are still in the congressional district. And so if you add them in there, you lose your citizen voting age population for Latino minority majority seats. That's why that seat has to be the way it is. However, to satisfy those rules, you end up breaking up the actual community, all the people in the Coachella Valley that live together.
Wow. So some pretty staggering changes at all levels for the Coachella Valley. I mean, the assembly, again, we maintain 2 seats, but when you look at the senatorship and Congress seats, congressional seats, that's pretty significant for us. I mean, it just puts so many more people in the mix when it comes to advocacy, legislation, and the interest of the Valley as a whole.
Absolutely. And so where we are now, looking at these 3 maps, this is just the state and federal iteration. A lot of the cities, I said that everything has to be done by December. I take that back. The county and state and federal have to be done by December because the filing for candidacy opens in February, closes in March, and it takes a little bit of time to prep those elections. But the city issues, they have got a little bit of time into the spring to finish this up because they don't open their filing for candidacy until July of next summer, 2022. So it'll open in July and end in August, and then we'll be running in those districts. So Indio is by district, and so are other cities in the Valley, and they'll be redrawing those lines on a city by city basis. But really looking at this commission, this is where the short-term impact I think is going to be the biggest. And what we need to be thinking about is sending in the public comment to the commission and saying, hey, let's try and keep our valley whole as much as possible. Don't take some of our cities like Palm Springs and Palm Desert and link them with places that are 100 miles away, and don't share interests. And it's that Senate seat that linked Needles and Blythe with coastal San Diego is egregious. It splits our valley. And if you have to split us up, at least try and keep the economies in those communities of interest to scale. Especially as a business organization, I think it's important that we advocate for our tourism industry and our ag industry, and we have strong representatives in both of those places. And the way they have India on that Senate seat doesn't do that.
Wow, really important stuff. So on the note of the commenting, and you shared that the public comment that appears there on wedrawthelines.org, that is reviewed by the commissioners and could potentially sway how they draft the final versions of those maps, what's the timeline that we have for people to take action? And how is the rest of this process just going to play out?
So over the next 2 to 3 weeks, we're going to be seeing the final iterations of maps. And there was allegedly a vote scheduled for the week of the Christmas holiday. And once that vote is final, the state legislative maps and the federal maps will be final, and they'll take effect January 1. That said, there's still some opportunity for the commissioners to make changes. They have meetings set up between now and then where they're talking through these things. And so, our job as folks that want to advocate for our valley is to continue to comment through the commission and talk about things like keeping our cities whole, keeping our valley whole, and seated as much as possible in the same seat so that we don't get split up.
Okay, so the best way to influence the lines and a potential redrawing to keep us all whole would be to make that public comment.
That's correct. You can do that by clicking on the contact page on wedrawthelineca.org and the community input form here. You list your name, your organization if you have one, the type of feedback you're drawing, and we want to talk about input on the line drawing specifically, and what community or district are you providing. This is going to be where we'd say the Coachella Valley, and then we can share our comments here. Please keep the Coachella Valley whole. Please do not link the Coachella Valley with San Diego in a state Senate seat. Please keep Indio with the rest of the tourism cities in the Coachella Valley, those kind of comments. And then a place to put your county, your city, any neighborhoods you might have, and then submit. And it's really that simple.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, on behalf of the chamber and the business community, we will absolutely be sharing short form resources for anyone who's interested in sharing their comment. But we want to implore everybody in the Coachella Valley to understand that the lines that are being drawn impact all of us in one way, shape, form, or another. The future of our development, our economic interests, our industry interests are all on the line here, to be punny. But thank you so much, Chris, for the overview. Do you have any other insights or nuggets of wisdom you'd like to share about the process or anything in general with Redistricting?
Just get involved. I mean, it's now or never on these lines. It's really important to have comments in there. And so I just implore everybody to take a stand. I mean, we only get to do this once every 10 years, and then we're all going to forget about it, and I'll see you all in a decade.
Sounds good. I'll see you sooner than that. Thank you so much for your time, Chris.
Thanks so much.